I'm already being poured out as a libation. At the time of my departure, it's come. I've fought the good fight. I've finished the race. I've kept the faith. From now on there is reserved for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Without even having to know you very much, maybe some of you I virtually don't know at all, and I can tell you that there will come a point in time when Christ will appear to you. It will happen either when you breathe your last, or it will happen when Christ comes to claim his throne here on earth. But one way or another, Christ will appear to us, and this has been one of the central doctrines of the Christian faith for as far back as anyone can remember. It's written into the creeds that we await the return of Christ, that we await the appearing of Christ. And there's a couple of reasons that that's an important thing for us to understand. One of the reasons is that as we look at the world around us, we have basically failed to create good. The best instrument that we can think of on a worldwide scale to create, order is government. And there are governments all over the world. There are some that are better than others at creating order, at keeping peace. But government is basically a broken instrument that has failed to create good in people. Government has failed to create good in people. Now, it's done an okay job in some instances of mitigating sin, of keeping the chaos of our evil from breaking out into complete disorder in the world. But we realize the government has ultimately failed in creating good in people. And so we await the return of Christ, who will come as king. And his country, his kingdom, will encompass the globe. And his country will create good. It will make good on the ways that we have fallen short as human beings. The other reason, though, it's important that we as Christians understand that Christ is coming back is that, well, if we take any given sliver of human history, we realize that there's fundamentally injustice due to our sin. That we have created an unjust world where children are taken advantage of by adults, where the rich take advantage of the poor, where the marginalized are also dehumanized. And we see these injustices all over the world, even in our own backyard. And we say, how can there be a good and just God? Well, the answer is God's not done yet. Christ will return and vindicate his justice. We will see the justice of God when Christ appears. So we wait for the appearing of Christ. But there is yet another reason, a third reason that we believe that Christ will appear. And this is perhaps the simplest. Christ said he would, and we believe him. So we await the return of Christ. And Paul believes this. Not only does Paul believe this, in his letter to Timothy, he says he longs for the appearing of Christ. I want to read that for you. Reading from, again, 2 Timothy 4, verse 8. For now there is reserved for me the crown of righteousness, which the righteous judge will give to me on that day. And not only to me, but all who have longed for his appearing. I wonder if you've ever thought about the difference between waiting for something and longing for it. I spent a little time thinking about that this week. What's the difference between waiting for something and longing for it? I think that the difference is when we wait for something, it doesn't necessarily change our action here and now. We don't necessarily adjust our lifestyle when we're waiting for something. But when we're longing for something, we did it. For instance, I ordered some books on Amazon this week, and I'm waiting for those books. I'm not going out of my way to long for those books. I do check the mail, but I check the mail every day. I'm not changing my behavior. I still go to work. However, if I were to long for those books from Amazon, I would take a couple of days off of work so I could search the internet and read all the reviews while I'm waiting for those books to come. I would go and make sure that my spot where I'm going to read that book is just so prepared. And I'd change out the light bulb to make sure I have a good reading light. I would go and check the mail on a regular basis, probably 2 or 3 times a day, because I'm longing for those books to get here. It's affecting my actions here and now. And I think this is the difference between waiting and longing for something. I went into a restaurant this week, And I think there's another example of it. It was a Western-themed restaurant, and on the wall was a sign that said, "I've spent most of my life riding horses. The rest of it I've just wasted." Now that's the sign for someone who longs to ride horses. I remember our state championship football season. Every spare moment we had was about preparing for the opponent. It was about getting ready for the game. We played football, yes, but we ate football and we slept football. It was all about football that championship season. We longed to win the big game. I think sometimes even parents get into this when you hear them say things like, "My life is about my kids." We long to see our kids successful. So what is it that we long for? Maybe we can understand this word even a little bit better if we were to be able to read it in the Greek. In the Greek, this comes from the root word, and you may be familiar with this one. It comes from the root of the word agape, which is the word for love. But not just love, it's the divine love, the sacrificial kind of love. It tells us that in the given moment that we're in, there are sacrifices to be made for that thing we long for in the future. We see Christ himself demonstrate this. He sacrifices his own life on the cross for the future longing that his people would be redeemed. This is the concept really behind fasting. We Protestants have not actually been that good at fasting, especially not in the recent centuries, but this is the concept behind it, that we stop eating. Now that's another thing. We Protestants have changed it into silly things where we give up certain things that we probably shouldn't be doing anyway, but really fasting is very simple. It means stop eating. You stop eating until you get hungry, until you're on the early stages of starvation and you are waiting for God's action in the future. I asked the nominating committee before they made their final selection, we'll hear it today, I asked them to fast, to be hungry for God's answer on their selections. I asked the girls who will be baptized next week to the day before to fast, to be hungry for God who will act in their baptism. This is the concept of making an immediate sacrifice for the thing we're longing for in the future. Parents know this too, don't you? As your kids are growing up, you're not getting much out of that little baby. You're just putting a whole lot of work into it. You're losing sleep. You're losing your sanity, it feels like some days. You're sacrificing those things for the sake of your children. But why? But we long for them to be happy and healthy. And as we look back on the memories of them growing up and the people they become, we say, it's worth it. This is what it means to long for something. And what we see is, in Paul, he longs for the appearing of Christ. He's reordered his life for the appearing of Christ. He waits for it. So what does a Christian life look like that is longing for the appearing of Christ? Well, I think there are at least 3 marks. One of those marks is that there is an urgency about the gospel. That we realize we don't know the day or the hour or the time when Christ will appear. We just don't know it. And so what we do know is we have this moment. And we realize that in this moment, when Christ appears, it will be a judgment moment. Christ, the righteous judge, will appear. And in that moment, those who are outside of Christ will indeed receive the wrath and judgment of God that they deserve. And that those who are inside of Christ will receive mercy because Christ has paid the price. They will receive love. They will receive hope and joy. And so when we have an urgency about the gospel, when we long for him to appear, we plead with our friends and our neighbors and our family to come and be into Christ with us. One of the marks of those who long for Christ is indeed an urgency about the gospel. One of the other marks, though, is a peace within the world. Have you ever known someone who gets upset about every little thing that goes wrong in the world? I think we all probably can identify somebody like this. Something goes wrong and they just fly off the handle about it. But Christians don't have to do that. You see, if we don't believe that Christ is going to appear and make it right, then it makes sense. You ought to fly off the handle. But if you believe that Christ will come and every injustice and every wrong and everything that's just not right, Christ will make it right. We long for that. And it's a mark of a Christian that they can live at peace. And even in the midst of the turmoil, I'm not saying that we don't do anything. We certainly should work for justice. But we can admit we won't get there completely until Christ returns. But we're okay because Christ is returning. And the third mark, and my wife doesn't like it when I talk about this one, but the third mark is that Christians are excited to die. Christians are excited to die. And Brittany doesn't like this because I say, Brittany, I'm looking forward to dying. And she says, I'm not looking forward to you dying. I want you to stick around. And I get that. I understand. And it should not be misunderstood that Christians are somehow suicidal. We understand that with every breath we have an obligation, a duty, a responsibility to help to bring about the kingdom through the Holy Spirit. Still on earth. That's why we have breath. But there's also an aspect that we're looking forward to being with Christ when He appears to us. Paul uses the language of an athlete. He says, I fought the good fight. I've run the race. There's not an athlete I know of that dreads the finish line. There's no competitor I can think of that would say they're scared of the competition being over. They're looking forward to it. That's the moment they receive the reward, the crown of righteousness. And so we too as Christians, we look forward to death, when we will be with Christ, when our baptism is complete, and we live in eternity with Him, receiving the crown of righteousness that He has earned for us. We look forward to that day. So what do you long for? I know that the answer is Jesus. It's like the kid in Sunday school who's not paying attention, and then the teacher asks a question. Of course the answer is Jesus, right? And the truth is, it is Jesus. That's the answer, but be honest for a second. You don't have to say it out loud, but what do you long for? What do you get out of bed for in the morning? What gets your motor going? What's your life about? What do you long for? Now some of you would say, Pastor, I long for my husband or my wife, or I long for my children, or the job or the project that I'm working on. And those aren't bad things, and you're not a bad person for wanting those things. Please don't misunderstand me. Those are great. But when you long for those things, you miss one of the greatest pieces of our faith. And that is the guarantee of the goodness of God. You see, if I were also to ask you, would you say that your life is basically characterized by goodness? Some people would say no. Right now, no. Right now, it's not really characterized by goodness. And I bet that there's someone who's hurt you, or betrayed you, or left you, or maybe they died. And then the goodness that they brought into your life, it's gone. Or maybe the job or the project, it's ended. And so too has the goodness of that project gone. Isaiah puts it this way. He says, the grass will wither and the flower will fade. We've heard it in many ways. Nations will rise and they will fall. People will be born and they will die. Pleasure will wax and it will wane. Everything, the goodness of everything and everyone will end except the goodness of God. If your longing is toward your children or toward your husband or toward your job, turn away. Turn away from your children. Turn away from your husband. Turn away from your job and turn toward Christ. Long for Him. Because when the grass is withered and the flowers faded, when all the trappings of this world are gone, Jesus Christ in His glory will remain. Oh, what a day that will be. What goodness we will experience in that moment. Paul writes to his friend Timothy. And he says this.